Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Shah. I am a co-founder and partner at ILO Group. We're a women-founded, women-led education policy and strategy firm. I am joined here today by these two dynamic leaders. We have Dr. Katie Jenner, who is the Secretary of Education in Indiana, and Dr. Christina Grant, who is the State Superintendent of Education in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Tennessee Commissioner Penny Schwinn was unable to join us today. She got called away at the last minute. But today, we are going to focus on bold leadership and big bets. At ILO Group, we work with district superintendents and state commissioners across the country on their biggest priorities in three main ways: leadership coaching and development, implementation, and strategic planning, and have really seen firsthand what the pandemic has meant for education, particularly for leaders and especially for women leaders in this space. So we're going to spend time today hearing from these two women on their experience and the big bets that they are taking in their states. I hope you find the conversation engaging, and please, we'll stick around after if you have questions. So we're going to start with learning recovery, learning loss, accelerated learning. There's many terms that have been used for what students have experienced over the last 2 years in academics, which is certainly, of course, the core competencies of K-12 education. A study earlier this year from Brookings showed that learning loss because of the pandemic was larger than losses for students in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. That same study found that achievement gaps between low poverty and high poverty schools increased by double-digit percentages. And results from a standardized test known as iReady, which is taken across the country by many students, found that learning loss in mostly black schools was 183% higher compared to mostly white schools. So we certainly have existing challenges, enhanced challenges in education. And Katie, I want to start with you to talk both about your kind of prior experience and conversations around reading, and certainly your enhanced plan around early literacy and the science of reading, and maybe start by telling us what that means, science of reading, and then would love to hear more about the work you're doing and the impact you're seeing.
Sure. Well, first, I'll start with a welcome, and I want to, if Penny Schwinn is watching in Tennessee, those of you who know Penny Schwinn and the work that they're doing in Tennessee, it is good stuff. You should definitely check out some of their press releases around their teacher apprenticeship, their high-impact tutoring. It's really incredible. So we talked about at breakfast this morning, we miss our friend Penny, but all the love certainly to Tennessee as she's working with her legislature right now, and that sometimes happens. So when we think about, also Utah's chief is here, who's also a female and a role model for us. So I want to shout out for Utah as well.
Hi, Sydney.
Oh yeah, Utah.
Hello, Sid.
So early literacy, I mean, we have for years and years and years as a country been on a mission to do everything possible that we can for our students. And COVID for us has, you could look at it as an incredible challenge, which it is, but with challenge comes enormous opportunity. And so in Indiana, we're being very real. Here's what our data shows, and now we have to get after it. So let me start with the data. We have in Indiana, our only longitudinal data point that we have is a reading assessment called iRead3. And when I say the only longitudinal data point that we have as a state, it's not because we haven't followed the federal law. We have in assessment. It's because we've adjusted our assessment over time. But iRead3, we have a 10-year look at how our students are doing across the state of Indiana, across our student populations. This past year, we had 81% of students who passed at third grade, meaning 19%, almost 20% can't read. And everyone in here, you're at an education conference, so I'm thinking that everyone in here knows what that data point means for that child for the rest of their life. It is It gives me cold chills to even think about. I mean, it's so important that kids can read by third grade. So we acknowledge the data. We understand that. We partnered with National Center for Assessment to do a deep dive and give us some really honest information. But then that flips to solutions. So what can we do? What can we quickly deploy in partnership with our local school leaders, of which we have several in this room, to really get after it for kids? So one thing I'll mention, science of reading, and you asked about what is the science of reading, what does that mean? I'm a high school teacher, let me just be clear, CTE. So me talking about reading when a room full of elementary teachers is like, oh, Jiminy. But the science of reading is essentially adding additional phonics, phonemic awareness in instruction for our children. So we have watched closely. Again, I talked about state leadership, and we watch closely what other states have done, specifically Mississippi. Dr. Carrie Wright, you Mississippi?
Yeah.
So we learned a lot from what Mississippi did. I mean, Mississippi was like 50th in NAEP scores, and they had the largest growth in our country. And what they did is they focused on the human capital. They focused on the teachers to make sure they were comfortable in teaching reading. And they deployed instructional coaches, and they were hired, the state-local partnership, across the state of Mississippi. So we thought with Indiana, how could we quickly deploy and really acknowledge our most vulnerable students in the data and what our data shows? So we have 100 schools, elementary schools, in our most vulnerable student populations where their data is showing that they could use some extra support. We are focusing on them. We did not do it as a state requirement. And now, philosophically, some of you might disagree with me. And if we come back next year, it might change. But I'm going to tell you, I asked our General Assembly to let's not require it yet. Let's try to start with opting in. Because if you've ever led a school, that buy-in by the principal and the teachers, it's key. And you can, as a state, invest, or as a company, a vendor, invest. I mean, you can partner, you can do, but unless there's buy-in, the data point's not going to move. So we have 100 schools across our state who are going to be partnering with us. We'll hire shared instructional coaches to work with schools, progress monitoring, watching those outcomes. That's one piece. Second piece, teacher prep colleges. Teacher preparation, regardless if you're K-3 or if you're a high school teacher to start. How many high school teachers in here had kids in their class who couldn't read? Yeah. And you get them and you're like, I don't know. I'm going to do my best, but So our teacher preparation programs and colleges are super important to make sure that they are also immediately teaching the science of reading. And how to teach reading to all their teachers. So that's the second piece of that partnership. The third piece is, you might ask, okay, well, what about the other elementary schools who might have 92% pass, but that's still not enough. There's still 8% not passing. So I'll speak about something probably later on, but we've launched the Indiana Learning Lab, which is a platform across our state open to all synchronous and asynchronous professional learning for our people. And we'll have science of reading resources all over that. The only other piece I'll mention is you always have to keep your eye on, when you think about data, also how are you assessing? What does that assessment look like? What is it telling us? So the one thing we realized is, okay, wait a second. If the end of third grade is too late, like if that's too late to know that 19% of students in Indiana can't read, what can we do to not add an extra burden on our schools, but to really, get after it? So we decided, hey, we're going to do a study to take our iRead and allow it to be given in second grade. If the student passes, they're done. But we're also building an on-track indicator so that it gives an extra bit of information for our schools and our parents to see if kids are on track in second grade, and then we can just drive intervention and remediation. So we needed 30 to 35 schools to pilot in the state. We had 400 schools across Indiana. I know, I see your eyes. It's wild. Shocked the heck out of me, I tell you. 400 schools across the state of Indiana raised their hand and said, we want to try this for kids. I heard from a Northern Indiana teacher. She had 59% of her second graders pass, and she was so pumped because she wants to keep those students moving, but guess what she can now do? Those other 40%, she can just go, and triage and resources. So that's just a little bit about the early literacy.
Thanks, Katie. You spoke a lot about data and the importance of knowing where kids are and where we're trying to go. And Christina, I wanted to turn to you to talk about that. A lot of states over the last couple of years suspended standardized testing in the state per the pandemic, per our response to a national crisis, for all the reasons. I know DC is planning to pick that back up. I think a lot of states are, and just want to hear more about what you're expecting to see in those results and the big bets you're planning to take to accelerate learning in the state.
Thanks. First, good afternoon, morning. What time is it? I don't know if any of you, this is my first trip across the country since the start of the pandemic. And coming into a conference space, it's a different level of anxiety than I've wrapped my head and heart around. And so want to come into the space just offering that, ooh, this is a lot. And so with that, good morning. And then before I answer the question, shamelessly, I do just want to acknowledge a very important person in the front row, who is Horus Ryan, who is a sophomore at Morehouse College. Before I became the state superintendent for Washington, D.C., I was the chief of schools in Philadelphia, and Horace was one of my freshmen in a high school who told me in his freshman year that he wanted to go to Morehouse, and then told me when he applied, and then told me when he got in. And then today walked up to me, who I have not seen in years, and said that not only is he at Morehouse on a full scholarship, but he is a sociology and education major. And so, as I frame my comments on the big bets we're taking in DC, I'm grounded in the reality that the bets pay off, because Horace will have my job, he will have your job, and I could name 125 other Horaces, like all across my schools. My kids are, and you will learn, they are my kids. And I treat them like that. And so even today I was like, here's my bag, get these pictures. But yeah, so they know. But greetings from your nation's capital, key word, your nation, under the great leadership of Muriel Bowser, also Black Women Leadership Matters. We are making some historic investments in public education in a state where individuals are thinking about areas to cut or things to scale back. We are unapologetically doing more in DC. 3 weeks ago, we announced a 6% increase in public funding in education, doubling down on investments that we've made over her first 8 years in office and what we hope will be 4 more years as we aspire and seek to be the 51st state of this great country. And those investments, you know, it starts in this reality of, you know, I very much grew up in a school of what gets accounted for gets done. And so I believe in assessment. I entered into the role in the process of us being in a state waiver. And it's been really interesting coming out of the pandemic. So, you know, the school doors reopen and everyone's like, well, what did the children learn? Or what didn't they learn? I think it's critically important that we don't ground what children have just experienced in a negative mindset. I think we're going to learn fascinating things. Some things are common sense. We knew that it might not have been a smart idea for children to stay home for a year and a half, right? We knew that. And so I don't think we have to start every single conversation grounded in the negative. Oh my God, the children are not broken. Our children are resilient. We opened the school doors. The children showed up. And in fact, every school I walk into, they're like, hey, you look important. Don't you ever close this school again. Don't you ever. And the kids are like, we don't ever want to be home with them. And I'm like, who are them? And the parents, I remember the first day of school, I went to a high school, and a mom, this baby is a senior, and the mom, she almost didn't stop the car. She was like, get out. And, I was like, no. And then she was like, wait, take a picture. And I was like, turn around and take a picture for your mama. This is the last day of your last year. This is the first day of your last day of school. And so the big bets we're making, one, it is getting the assessments restarted. And I think that part has been really interesting. So we didn't have assessments for 2 years. If you know anything about DC, all we want to spend time doing is looking at the data to show, like, we are better, we are growing. And when you don't have it, we're like, well, what do we argue about? So it's the first time where principals, everyone is like, are you administering the assessments? And so we are. We actually are in our NAEP year as well, and so we just finished our NAEP window. We're really excited to see what that data is going to tell us. We pride ourselves in saying that we've had 10 years of consecutive growth on our PARCC exams, and we know that in certain areas that information may hold true. But what we also know is that we are going to ground ourselves in the realities of the gaps in learning. But I'm not going to frame it as learning loss, right? We are making historic investments in accelerated learning, starting with a $40 million investment in high-impact tutoring. And so every child across the district, public or charter, will have access to tutoring, not just in their instructional day, but we are also partnering with community-based organizations, children and family protective services, parks and recreation. So the unique design of DC means that a child can get tutoring when they go to the rec center. A child can get tutoring if they're in foster care. A child can get tutoring if they're homeless. A child can get tutoring through their church. A barbershop can apply to get resources. And the tweak on that isn't just a person with another adult. It's how do you create high quality tutoring sessions? And I'm particularly passionate about it because everyone sitting in this room knows that the achievement gap isn't just a gap that's grounded in money. It's grounded in access. And so if I were to go home, so I have a 12-year-old goddaughter, she spends all my money. If she came home today and said, I'm struggling in X, I literally would just call someone and be like, here's a tutor. And when you think across this country, so many families don't have the ability to say, here's a tutor. And so we're making that investment. We're allowing schools to redesign their school schedules to accommodate tutoring. And it's a stated expectation that children will have access to tutoring. Right now, today, 4,000 children are having access to tutoring. And we just started releasing the funds this year. Our goal is to get to all 95,000 students. And it's a core part of our recovery work. That's one aspect of accelerated learning. And I'll be really quick. The other, it's an alignment around things we knew. So on the state level side, we're cleaning up attendance policies because the pandemic taught us so much about what it means to be in school. With our educator prep providers, we issued new regulations to really drill home. So we all walked away and went to our house and teachers were like, Zoom, tell me more. What is this Zoom thing? So there are all these new platforms that educators now have in their toolkit. We need them to be trained in those tools as they're coming into the profession. We're stepping back and and I'll talk more about wellness in a second. But I think the question everyone is like, oh my God, what's the exams gonna tell us? I'm like, the data is going to tell us what assessments have always told us. They're going to tell us where are the gaps, and then we have to align our resources to move forward. But this isn't going to be a conversation where children are going to be attacked or made to feel bad on this tool. An assessment is a tool that gives us information that helps us realign our steps forward. And we're excited about the realignment, but we believe the investments we're making on the front end are going to help get ahead of what we will see. And I'm excited about this year's results. I'm more excited about what we'll see a year from now, right? And so we can ground ourselves in this year, but that following year, that third year, I talk often about being on the road from recovery to restoration. And so we know we will be restored when our children are learning at the levels that they were learning pre-pandemic. We know we will be restored when our graduation rates return or exceed. We know we will be restored when we're opening new and innovative education models, right? We know we'll be restored when our teachers are whole and healthy and back in the classrooms with their children. We know we'll be restored when our kids are popping up on us at conferences like, hey, remember me? You used to yell at me in the hallway. Those are all of the metrics that we're thinking through. And I would say big investment around high impact tutoring. And the other area, before I stop talking, is all we learned about what happened to 11th graders and 12th graders during the pandemic. So we're making seismic investments on their education and post-secondary readiness. We've stood up a scholarship called DC Futures. It's a $12 million investment that literally is paying the tuition of our residents to go to college. So we saw that there was a decline in enrollment, and we are partnered with 3 universities, our local public university and 2 private, where residents will receive $8,000 a year every year for what we call last dollar scholarships. So once you get in, run your financial aid. If there is a gap, we will pay that gap for you to get your first credential. And the majors are tied to high skill, high wage earning careers. And so I think on both sides, yeah, we're excited about the assessments, but we also know that a lot of folks just didn't go to college last year. And so we have to be unapologetic about getting them into college and getting them into their credential. And I know I spoke a lot, so I'm gonna stop now.
Well, that's great. You went right where we were heading next.
Oh, okay. Usually that's me. I just feel really good at it. It's you
said,
this time. It's usually me, I promise.
Penny was like, I'm so sorry. I was like, I think Katie and I, we gonna be all right.
That's awesome.
You took us where we were headed. We're going to talk about pathways. Obviously, K-12 is in the service of what's next for students. And Katie, I'll turn it to you to be able to talk about the educational attainment work you're doing in Indiana.
Yeah, so I think we always have to start with the data. Again, I told you about what our real honest data was about with literacy. Literacy is, again, a key point for a child. Another key point for all of us as people is educational attainment. And we know that it impacts our everything from sustainable income to quality of life to health can tie back to the educational attainment of a child. So in Indiana, it's pretty interesting. Christina mentioned NAEP scores. On average, we typically hover around 15 in terms of states where we score on NAEP. But when we look at educational attainment, depending on the economist you speak to, Indiana is between 35th and 40th. So our students are not continuing on to get that additional credential of value. So then we dug a bit further, and we thought, okay, so 64% of Indiana students graduate. We have about 85,000 in a cohort, in a senior class, 85,000. So 64% graduate with some sort of college credit. Okay, let's dig a bit further. Of that 64%, the average student leaves with 13.5 college credits. In Indiana, a short-term credential of value that can be linked to a high-wage, high-demand job begins at around 18 credits. And for those of you who've been in the high school sector at all, one high school class is typically 3 college credits. And therefore, we have students sitting in our classrooms across the state who are graduating within 1 to 3 courses of leaving with a credential of value in addition to their diploma, which is major if you think about access and really changing the opportunity for kids. So we launched something called Crossing the Finish Line. You're welcome to Google it. I'll give you high level. Crossing the Finish Line is, we partnered, and partnerships in all of this are key. We partnered State of Indiana, K-12 with higher ed, with our governor's workforce cabinet, and our community college system, Ivy Tech and Vincennes University. And we said, pull all the data and tell us how many students are this close within 1 to 3 classes of completing a credential. We launched at the end of April last year. We had 2,000 students over the summer who worked to get most of their credential completed. 700 students earned a credential, saved families $1.4 million. We said, you know what, let's try this again. We launched it again this year, had our community college systems run the data. 17,000 students approximately from one of our community college systems are eligible. 17,000 are eligible, and they probably don't even know that they're this close to completing a credential of value. So we're partnering with our high schools across the state. Last summer, we had 275 high schools. This summer, we will likely have more. Partner again to get students across the finish line with a credential of value, because that's one thing. When we look at our college going rate as a nation, one of the data points we collect in Indiana is upon high school graduation, what is your plan? And what's interesting is we had 79% of our students say, I plan to continue going to college, to training, and only 59% made it. So 20% had the dream and they didn't make it. And that gives me cold chills to think about. And it's our student populations that we have to target that and be focused. So the other one I want to mention, and again, this is another one you can Google. It's the 3E Pathway Grant. And I was on a panel last week, and they said that you just said about 6 E's. So follow me on this. We're focused on 3. But if we really want to make sure students are ready, regardless of their purpose and what they feel to employ, enroll, or enlist leading to service, then we must, in our K-12 space, in the 13 years we have children, be as strategic as possible. And that means rethinking high school. Rethinking high school, that 11th and 12th grade space has to be laser focused on, again, the credentials of value and making sure we're being intentional and supporting students, and scheduling, and also work-based learning. Because remember, you in this room, you have access to so many people. If you have kids who you can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, my child wants to do this. Can you talk to them? Most of our children don't have that. And so the work-based learning, we're really leaning in, and we have not solved that, let me tell you. But we're really leaning in Indiana on focusing on that experiential learning at the 11th and 12th grade, which means elementary and middle, you have to help students explore and engage. So that's the 3 E's, explore and engage so that you can experience while in high school. Again, 3 key priorities. Number 1, post-secondary credential completion of value linked to high-demand, high-wage jobs. Number 2, increase quality access to work-based learning. And then the third, which is a secondary goal, is, again, increasing the exploration and engagement for our students so that they can dream big. The only other one I'll mention, and I'm actually not going to because we have 12 minutes and like a million more questions. I'll just say Google Indiana GPS. Indiana Graduates Prepared to Succeed. We had a session on it yesterday, and it's rethinking how we are looking at data from early learning through K-12 through post-secondary outcomes, including labor participation rate, median income. We'll be able to tell you that for every class of students by high school in the state of Indiana. Part of it's already live, but the main rollout is fall 2022, and it is packed with indicators because it's a data story that's much deeper than an assessment. An assessment is important, but a lot of other indicators. So.
Thank you, Katie.
I think it's back to you.
I'll take it
Christina, but yeah.
Well, hopefully you can see why these 2 women are on this panel and the amazing work that they're leading in their states. I want to take a minute just to acknowledge student well-being and adult well-being, and something that has always been true in school systems and across our country, and certainly was brought to light and everyone was forced to reckon with during the pandemic. So Christina, I want to start with you to talk about how y'all are supporting students and adults in DC.
Yeah, it's been interesting. That's why I opened the way that I did. I talk about the recovery work, and I often say that the individuals leading the recovery work are also recovering. And it's a missed moment that, in a lot of ways, I remember the pandemic at 7 o'clock, people go outside and they like bang on their pots and pans for like the healthcare workers. When we reopened schools, I was like, where are the people? I want pots and pans. Like I want because I have never, right? That, the reopening our schools, which was a stated goal in DC of getting our schools open, keeping them open, having our children be safe. We knew that was the best place for our children to be in school. What was missed in that was the emotional well-being of our staff and our leadership. And so it's a different conversation around ESSER investments that I don't hear a lot of individuals talking about it, but I do want to share what we're doing in DC. And so from the children's side, we've rewritten suicide prevention curriculum. What a lot of individuals are not talking about, particularly amongst Black and brown children and Black boys, is there is an alarmingly high suicide rate. And so we actually have to stand up curriculum, training, professional development on what happens when the child tells you that they're not okay. Because when you're in the classroom, many of us who have been teachers, our children come to us with everything. And so we stood up those resources for training. But on the side of adults, and I don't know if any of you experienced this when the schools reopened, the children were really happy to see each other, but adults were standing in corners crying, right? That they had lost colleagues, family members. What happens when the second grade teacher who was here isn't here anymore? And so on our teacher side, we've stood up resources for emotional wellness for all of our educators in the classroom so that they can get training. But for our leadership, which I'm particularly passionate about, no one is checking on the superintendents. No one is checking on the principals. And so in DC, we've stood up ESSER resources for every principal, district or charter, to have their own wellness coaching that's outside of their system. And it's really important because when you're not okay, you can't tell your principal you're not okay. That's not how that works. That's not how we're trained. We're not conditioned. I am not conditioned to go to my manager and say, I'm not well. You probably shouldn't let me make all these decisions today, right? But if we have the resources, we can go to a licensed provider that can help us, where we can call and say, when Omicron started, if I didn't have a therapist, Lord, I was like, wait, it's back again. Like we can't, what are we supposed to do? We have to test all the children. And I'm making light of it because that is another way that we've been trained to cope through really hard things. We tell ourselves like, well, I'm just going to be strong and like make a quick joke. But I'm unapologetic about the way that it's important for us to talk about mental health in public education. It's important for us to talk about leaders not just being trained on how to teach a child how to read, but how do you actually teach a child how to emotionally self-regulate? When we think about discipline and suspensions and all of what happens in school, it's because we don't teach children social emotional wellness strategies. And so as we are getting the school doors open, we are going to have the conversation around social emotional learning standards. Kindergartners need to understand happy. They need to understand sad. When I am frustrated, what should I do? And both our teachers of the year are here, and our 2022 teacher of the year, she has wellness centers in her classroom where her pre-K babies can go and sit under a plant and just sit there. And they can say, I don't feel well right now. They don't throw a chair. They don't hit another classmate. They don't walk out of the room. But they know they can go sit under the plant. And a part of the work we need to lead in public education is helping everyone, teacher, principal, superintendent, where's your plant and how do you go get there? And how do we pay for it? So the same way we can have these long conversations about assessment and CTE and post-secondary wellness, we also should be having those same conversations about mental health and wellness, because what we as a country just experienced is not okay. And we won't build back better if we actually don't start with self. And so I know that was long, but And I would say that, like, I was not trained to talk this way, right? I have 3 degrees in education from all of the schools. And this is not the sign of leadership, right? Leadership, particularly for women, is not grounded in going in rooms and saying, like, I'm not okay. Did you see all those people? I have every time this door opens, I'm like, whew, another person. But if we really do want, like, what's on the other end of school shootings and violence and crime, what's on the other end of all of that is mental health wellness. How do you self-regulate? What do you do when you're not okay? And so I'm really grateful for the question. It is a twist that we are spending significant ESSER recovery dollars into staff wellness. But I do think it's the through line to where we want our children to be in the future. Like, wars will end when people are mentally well.
I want to keep on that thread, and particularly in leadership. We've seen a lot of turnover in leadership, especially since the pandemic. ILO Group, our firm, put out a report. I just want to share a few stats before we can wrap up here. Since 2020, more than a third of the nation's largest districts have had a change in leadership. That is the highest it's ever been. Over that same period, 70% of people appointed to the chief position have been men. And men have been appointed in 75% of districts that previously had been led by women. So in education, the majority of the workforce is women, the majority of the leadership is men, and often white men. And there's a lot of work we had and progress we really had been making that the pandemic has really shifted back to how it had been before. We know how much better it is for kids when their teachers and their leaders are representative of their lived experience. And at ILO Group, we certainly value that and aim to support leaders in that space. And so I know you two have been living this on the front lines, and so just want to wrap up with a question to you both on really to what do you attribute your success, and to the extent that you want to speak about it, really being a woman leader in this space.
Oh, okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for that question, and this is probably, I would think, for no matter who you are in the room, I mean, we are who we surround ourselves with. And so if you choose people who build you up, if you choose people who, if they see you're going down the wrong route, will just be honest and say, hey, let's look at it differently. That's key. So it starts with the people. The other thing is we're at this conference. Every time I go to a conference or meet new people, it's incredible how cyclical this world is and how much it comes back around. And so as we're all connecting, as we have, there's no doubt that some of these connections that we've made will continue. So it starts with people. Number 2, that just in reflection, I think it's also, and we talk about this at breakfast, it's also about balance. I don't know if this is the right thing as a leader, and this is, again, man, woman, this is just, but compartmentalizing, I compartmentalize a lot. I am a mom to 6th grade daughters. We have more hormones flowing through our house. But I am a mom, and I also work crazy long hours and love, and am passionate about what we do. But when I'm on, when it's work time, it is all about that. But I think as people, and this goes back to the mental health piece, we have to set up, we learned this a little bit through COVID, we have to set up the boundaries as people, and when is your time? When is your family time? When is your own personal time, your personal space? So when it's work time, we need to get after it, but we also have to acknowledge that that's key. The only other thing is sometimes your best yes is a no. Sometimes your best yes is a no. And we talked about this a bit this morning. Everyone in here, you are absolutely leaders in your communities, in your states, in the country. And you get asked to do a lot of different events, a lot of different things. it is okay to say no and to not attend because you need to do this or you need downtime or whatever. So those are three things I think as a leader that I am keenly aware on: people, balance, and making the best decisions in terms of my schedule.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. On the eve of the confirmation of the first African-American Supreme Court justice, who happens to be a Washingtonian, we are showing out in D.C. as we think about women in leadership. And so I would say quickly, who you serve matters. My leadership is a direct reflection of my mayor, who has several women in her cabinet. And I think that's important to call out. You don't get to lead in spaces where you don't see individuals who look like you and sound like you leading. And so even though it is hard, when the first time someone called me about being a state superintendent, I was like, oh, no, I'm good. I'm over here, with my children. And then they called back and they were like, you thought this was like an optional conversation. And so then it does go to what Katie is sharing. I surround myself with women superintendents who are excellent. And we don't talk about it, but you have to be excellent. Because we are sitting in spaces that are new spaces. There are new seats. I encourage you to watch the confirmation hearing if you haven't. My confirmation hearing was 8 hours long. And you do have to sit in the chair. And you have to answer the question. And you have to answer it again. And then you have to answer it with a smile. And then you have to answer it, and then you might have to sing at the end of it. And you have to do those things in order to break the ceilings, to sit in the seat, so that when you walk into a school, when I walk into a school and a young girl looks up and she says, like, oh, are you the secretary? Someone says, no, she runs this entire education system. And then something clicks in the mind of that girl. So she's like, wait a minute. And my girls do it all the time. They're like, but wait a minute. And I'm like, yep, got on these shoes, don't sing. Ain't on nobody's music video. These books, let me tell you about how these books pay for this whole lifestyle. But that, jokes aside, those are the messages that we have to reshape in the minds of our girls. And we had this conversation at breakfast with my significant other. I cook all the time. I'm so domestic. And he's like, I wish I could tell people when you are going off in a budget hearing, she goes home and bakes chickens. And I was like, yes, but here's the distinction. I choose to cook this food. I don't have to cook this food. And the reason that women in leadership is critically important is the balance of the conversation. We get to be whole. We get to be whole, loved leaders. We have balance. We get to occupy these spaces. And I would just say the through line to it is knowing who you serve. It is a distinct joy and honor to serve under the leadership of Muriel Elizabeth Bowser. And I'm unapologetic about the sacrifices of what it means to be a woman in leadership, but the through line to children that need to see strong women sitting on stages so that they understand that this is their stage too. And for far too long, we've engaged in artificial conversations about what women are capable of doing. And it's just true. We can do anything and everything we set our minds to.
Thank you. We're going to end on that.